Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. This is going to be an academic exercise called a book talk. And since you can't reduce a book to a 45-minute talk, I'm going to sort of go deep on a little bit of it and gloss over, give you an idea what's in it, and I'm going to discipline myself to leave plenty of time for Q&A, and I'm happy to go as wide or as narrow or anywhere else you want to take me in Q&A. So that's by way of preliminaries. So this is drawn from Soldiers of Empire, Indian and British Armies in World War II, and this is the cover photo. It's inviting you inside with an open smile and a wry smile, I like to say. And let me say a little to situate the book for you and set up the particular material I want to talk about today. This is an Indian infantry section from 2-7 Rajput preparing to go on patrol in the Arakan in 1944. Their enemy out there on the jungle-covered ridgelines is the Imperial Japanese Army. Behind them in India, a great countrywide anti-colonial uprising had sputtered out while 3 or so million Bengalis and other Indians died in a man-made famine. What might be the significance of this squad of colonial infantry from the mid-20th century, late in the era of the World Wars? Not that far long ago. The book is a post-colonial military sociology and history of British Indian, and British imperial forces in the Burma campaign in World War II. I'm not here as a South Asianist, but as someone who thinks about the international dimensions or the imperial dimensions of the organization and use of military power in world politics. We have a very strong tendency to imagine the political military aspects of world politics in terms of nation states. Each state a sovereign and territorial monopoly on legitimate force that constitutes military power from within, nationally, and projects it outwards. So we tend to think about armies with their qualifier of the nation, the US Army, the British Army, the German Army, and so on, all drawn from a corresponding national society. In fact, a recurrent feature of world politics is the transnational and international constitution of armed force, the raising of troops and other forms of military power in imperial and hierarchical contexts. For example, the training of Iraqi and Afghan forces by invading powers in the first decades of the 21st century. Much of the study of military history, military sociology, war and society scholarship, security studies more generally, has proceeded by assuming the world is made up of nation states, and always has been, or nation state equivalents. And it does so in ways we've come to recognize as Eurocentric. In those frames of national armies, 2-7 Rajput and the 2.5 million strong British Indian Army in World War II, they drop out. It's like they never were there. As do many other colonial and foreign military forces. For example, the long-running relationship between the United States and the Philippines, and the large numbers of troops that we drew up from the Philippines. As late as 1970, there were more Filipinos in the US Navy than in the Philippine Navy. So when I say Eurocentric and nation state, I'm not referring to the need to recover subaltern or non-Western histories. I'm saying something different. We actually now have a lot of social histories of colonial armed forces. My point is the way in which general approaches and theories, the questions we ask, the debates we have, the historiographies we've produced, concerned with the political military, have proceeded by taking as normal this world of nation states, modeled on an image of the Western nation state as its ideal typical formation. Nowhere is this more true than in debates over how soldiers are made and why they fight. Scholarship focuses almost exclusively on the national armies of the major Western powers, with a particular emphasis on the US and Nazi Germany. I mean, if you added up all the military sociology about this question, most of it would be about those two countries. So what the book seeks to do is revisit the questions asked in this nation-state historiography, but takes as ordinary an imperial, multicultural army in which no one was working in their primary language, an army that was divided and ruled through colonial ethnicity. How might we reapproach some basic questions about military organization, combat motivation, outside of, but also in critical dialogue with, the nation state? So my book juxtaposes the experiences of Indian troops, British troops, and African troops training for and fighting the Japanese in the same campaign. Now, accounts of the Pacific War tend to emphasize race, nation, and ideology in accounting for the particularly intense and merciless combat, accompanied on both sides by refusal to accept surrender and other forms of extracurricular violence. How do we reread all of this against the British Empire's legions of illiterate peasants, evocative of the multiracial hosts of antiquity, as of the coalition forces of the global times to come? Why did they come to fight the Japanese in much the same way as US Marines? So colonial armies and other foreign forces, like the Indian Army, were significant in military terms in the world wars. These are important militarily, in terms of military power. But their more fundamental world historical significance was to expand and secure European imperial rule. European empires are unimaginable absent foreign military manpower. Other people fought for them. European expansion generated more or less continuous resistance abroad, while opponents of empire at home cited its cost in blood and treasure. In the academy, we tend to think of the globalized, interconnected world made and maintained by Western empires as if it occurred almost wholly in the realms of the political economic, Marxist theories, or the cultural. But empires were made and held by the sword, and the arm holding it was most often brown or black. So 27 Rajput here did its bit to secure Anglo-American liberal modernity. How was that possible? How did they come to do it? Why did they do it? And what does it tell us in general about that ultimate form of political power, armed force? Okay, let me make two more points before I go on. First, as to why the British Indian Army might be important or interesting to think about. It's useful to keep in mind an important dimension of how the regular, drilled, and disciplined army appears in scholarship and in popular military history. It appears as a special property of Western modernity that is rooted in Greco-Roman heritage. You know, think Victor Davis Hanson, if you know him. On this view, the regular army is one of those things that diffused from the West to the colonies. In this diffusion story, infantry discipline, although it's a set of ritualized practices and pedagogies discovered in many different times and places, somehow comes to underwrite the binaries of West-Occident and modernity tradition. You know, the army is Western and modern. I argue in the book that the army, in fact, destabilizes these binaries. The army is ancient and cosmopolitan in its form. Its discipline is at home anywhere in the world, as are soldiers. Its ideal typical motive forces derive from ritual, cycles of blood debt, and the harsh circumstances of the battlefield. Okay, second, and pulling out here a little bit, let me identify for you a convention of British military photographers in World War II. Always get into the frame the Lee Enfield rifle with bayonet fixed, you know, the light automatic, here a Bren gun, and the submachine gun here, an American-made Thompson that they preferred to the British Sten. If you added in an RPG, like a rocket-propelled grenade, and a mortar, you would have the basic set of infantry weapons that still accounts for most of the fighting going on in the world today, right? The newspapers, security studies academics, you know, we're drawn to the high tech, to drones. I don't know how many books I've seen on drones lately, and I think we forget some very old regularities. Bodies of troops trading casualties with one another with basic infantry weapons. This is an extraordinary form of social interaction. It's super important politically. States ultimately, their ultimate form of power is reference to coercive power. How do they generate it? How do they organize it? And the fact that they organize it so often and so much from foreigners on a transnational basis It's not what we think of normally, what our kind of mindset is about this. So, I'm trying to speak to these larger questions with my colonial army here. Okay. This is all the other photographs I have are photographs from the book. They're all from official British military photographers who visited the Burma front during the war, except for this one, which comes from a wartime popular magazine. These are some of the martial classes of the Indian Army in World War II. Now, when you think about the British Indian Army, if you've ever thought about it before, the first thing that is going to come to your mind is the martial races. And they were known as the martial classes by the Second World War. This is a kind of example of what T. Fujitani calls the polite racism of World War II era imperial military mobilization. You call them races in Victorian times, you call them classes in the 20th century. Now, martial races arose from the Orientalist idea that most Asian men were effeminate and unsuited for military service, unlike in the West, where every man could be made into a soldier. In the Orient, according to this theory, only certain races bred in specific climatic, geographical, or cultural circumstances were suited to military service. To the question of why did these soldiers serve, the British colonialist ethnography responds that they were naturally bred to be soldiers, and they served because the British rulers respected their culture, in quotes. So let us critically consider this idea as I go through my talk. Now, one of the framing conventions of military sociology is the notion that soldiers get their qualities from a combination of society or from the military, what happened in training or what they brought with them from society, which explains more of their behavior. Ideology from society or values incorporated once they were in the military. But the martial races, as you can see here laid out in kind of way in which the British would describe the subject peoples of India, or at least of North India, or most of them, they don't just exist out there in society, in reality, as if Victorian racial theories were accurate ethnographies of Indian society. Instead, the martial races were products of British imagination and Indian culture, and they were effects of colonial knowledges and disciplinary practices within the military. The martial races or classes had to be created out of a more or less fluid set of ethnic relations. They were constructed in and through military discipline by regulating organization, uniform, discipline, diet, and so the observance of religion, living arrangements, and so on, designed to produce each class as a separate ethnic group. And in order to explain how to do this to the young British officers who show up to run this army, the Indian Army produced martial races handbooks for each class of troops in a style that kind of combines colonial anthropology with the military manual. They're quite interesting reading. The stereotypes of the martial races were realized through disciplinary power, shaping recruits in the manner of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Sikhs who trimmed their hair or beards, for example, risked discharge from the army. A wartime British officer writing home of his experiences of training Sikh troops, the Sikhs have many religious customs. We see that they keep them, whether they like it or not. This is a military discipline-produced ethnicity. What the martial classes help us see is a kind of co-constitutive process where army discipline draws on cultural and social resources, modularly rearranges and disciplines its denizens into the correct categories, with consequences both for the army and for society shaped by generations of discharged veterans. One of the things that the martial races handbooks explained to these young British officers was the typical physique and comportment and dress of the martial class. In this way, the British officer could recognize the real deal, a real Pathan or a Sikh or a Dogra, as it were, while the Indian recruit needed only a few iterations of this process to figure out how he should present, comport, and conduct himself in order to get into the army. One of the things I'm not talking about tonight, and I should just mention here, because I'm focusing on the sort of cultural stuff, is there's a political economy to this army. This is an all-volunteer army. It's relatively well paid, and sons of prominent farmers will go into the army. Veterans got special circumstances from colonial justice, from colonial administration. They often got land grants, and so on. So there's a sort of political economic underpinning to this army that I'd be happy to talk about in Q&A. So people, in other words, the Indians are trying to get in the army. And if the British think a Pathan does this, well, I'm going to do that to see if I can get myself in as a Pathan. Now here you can see some of the basic rituals by which you create solidarity in the army, but here ethnicized in particular groups. So one of them, of course, nothing more conducive to a sense of commonality and solidarity than sharing a meal, breaking bread together. And so you would have each class of troops have its own mess and their own diet, right? They all had their own special food. You would give them holy men appropriate for their religion. And of course, you would give them different uniforms, different turbans, all to match up. Now, the degree and depth of this ethnic divide and rule of the Indian Army is even greater than it may so far seem. And bear with me just for a minute for a little bit of military detail. Now, I pointed out that 27 Rajput from the first slide, it's a battalion of 800 or so soldiers. It's a basic maneuver unit in Burma, and still is to a large degree. Now, a battalion is divided into companies of 150 or 200, and companies into platoons of 40 or so. Now, in Western armies, a company is frequently designated by a letter, A company, B company, and it kind of goes without saying that everyone speaks the same language and that the soldiers are interchangeable between the companies. They would, have the same common basis of identity in civil society. Now, by contrast, outside of the Gurkhas and a few other units, Indian Army infantry battalions in the World Wars were organized on what was called a class company basis. Each company was composed of a different class: the Sikh company, the Pathan company, the Dogra company, the Punjabi Muslim company, and so on. Companies were distinct both as an ethnic class and as a military unit. And each class had its own vernacular language, its own mess, its own quarters. And this battalion is a kind of Tower of Babel in which no one worked in their primary language, was crowned by the native English of the British officers and Hindustani Urdu as the language of command that everyone was expected to learn upon joining the army. So while the Indian Army was by no means an elite shock force, it worked. It functioned in combat against the Japanese, against Rommel's Afrika Korps, and on the slopes of Monte Cassino in Italy. Yet it was organized around a Victorian racial theory that divided and ruled it down to the company level. And I think we can only conclude from this that there's something about the Army, its forms of discipline, that are a more robust generator of the will to combat than we maybe think. It doesn't need a lot of outside stuff. And in fact, a lot of this stuff is getting in the way of functioning in modern warfare, as I'll speak about in a minute. Now, one of the consequences of this linguistic and ethnic structure of colonial militaries, among other factors, was the empowerment of an intermediary class of warrant officers responsible for discipline. And in the Indian Army, they were known as the Viceroy Commissioned Officers. They rose out of the ranks of a particular class and represented the interests of their class in the battalion. They enforced class discipline, in my ethnic terms. As one Indian officer put it, the old Indian Army was always meticulous in preserving orthodoxies and taboos. It never in any way tried to emancipate the men from their religious inhibitions. Itself a kind of liberal imperial ideology where that comment is coming from. Now, martial race's discourse often seemed self-evidently true to many British officers because they could see with their own eyes an army organized in its image, a panoply of ethnic soldiers. Their soldiers were bred to be naturally warlike, if in need of leadership. Young officers were inculcated in the martial races. They came to govern the military class system in accordance with their particular class prejudices of the regiments that they joined. So Eric Stokes, later a very prominent Cambridge historian of colonial India, and the kind of father of the Cambridge School of South Asian Studies, had been in the country less than a year as an officer cadet and subaltern of Indian Mountain Artillery when he wrote home to his sister during the war that his regiment took only the pick of Indian troops, in his case, Sikhs and Punjabi Muslims. The former are definitely more clever, but the Punjabis are easily the most lovable, he wrote. Now, the clever, scheming Sikh was by then a stock martial races trope. Serving later with Ahirs, a class recruited in wartime and not normally considered martial, Stokes described them as not soldiers by instinct. These are in his letters home. Indian soldiers were viewed as dependent and childlike. Quote, "There's probably no finer training and responsibility," he wrote, "than to command Indian troops, because like a teacher at school, they look to you so utterly for their welfare and happiness." New to India, Stokes had rapidly acquired a working familiarity with the martial races and colonial discourse, making sense of his experience through these categories. Stuck in a reinforcement camp awaiting deployment to Burma, Stokes was given various responsibilities over soldiers waiting for their assignments. In one affair, a Muslim havildar, a sergeant, charged with maintaining sanitary standards in the camp's kitchen, inspected a cookhouse used by Gurkhas, who were, of course, Hindu. "The old religious trouble flared up in the section today," wrote the young Stokes. "To a Gurkha, who is a strong Hindu, a Muslim is almost the devil himself." So for Stokes, it was a matter of religious bigotry amongst natives. No further explanation acquired. Throughout the army, Gurkhas and Muslim soldiers are interacting in various kinds of ways, right? But this is how it's read. So historian Christopher Bailey, who studied under Stokes, thought that Stokes' experiences in India had convinced him that castes and religions were concrete and sharply defined social units, an idea that informed Stokes' scholarship until he encountered Edmund Leach and Stanley Tambion in the 1970s. This is testament, I would argue, to the Indian Army's powers of constructing and naturalizing different ethnic groups. In the Army, the classes literally took form as distinct units. So with Stokes, I introduced the last piece of the Indian Army, the commissioned officers, who were mostly British until the interwar period, when a begrudgingly slow process of Indianizing the officer corps began, one vastly accelerated once World War II started. Now, here, just to lay this out for you, here's the British officer. Look how young he is. That'd be the company commander. Here's the VCO, that intermediate warrant officer, and here are two Indian soldiers. You can see the photograph is obviously staged, but it's in a forward area with actual troops. Now, one of the great myths of the Indian Army, in its memoirs, military histories, and the self-images of its officer corps, was that British officers knew, at least in Orientalist terms, the languages and customs of their troops. But even among the pre-war regular professional officer corps, linguistic competence was spotty and regularly bemoaned in the pages of service journals, while their cultural knowledge generally amounted to simplistic stereotypes hardly worth the label colonial knowledge. For example, the idea that Pathans were touchy about their honor. The wartime expansion of the Army, which drew in thousands of emergency commissioned British officers, the officers who actually commanded Indian soldiers in combat in World War II, these officers had little time to learn languages or culture. Basic understanding of Urdu along with English had to suffice. So another one of my British scholars who was a wartime officer, Ralph Russell, and who later became a leading scholar of Urdu, he was commented on his initial encounter with Indian Army language training. "I was really keen to learn Urdu. Well, but within a couple of weeks, I'd reluctantly given up because the officer instructing us didn't seem to know the language, especially the pronunciation." Of his fellow British officer students, Russell commented, that most of them were unenthusiastic about learning Urdu, i.e. the language that they were going to have to use to command their troops, and didn't see why they should waste time and effort on this inferior language. Quote, end quote. In the headquarters of his Chindit brigade in Burma during the war, Michael Calvert faced even greater linguistic complexity, at one point working with 7 different races: British, Indian, Burmese, Karen, Chinese, West African, and Gurkha. Quote, "I now know why cosmopolitan races gesticulate," he comments, after describing a situation in which he gave orders for a troop movement by charades. "To that lone tree on the hill, and I would look forlorn and lonely. There is your objective, and I would make motions to dig in madly." Yeah? Think about this as like actually functioning in war. I hope I'm beginning to give you a sense of what this looks like. Despite linguistic incomprehension, the army functioned. Surprisingly, fluency was not necessary for infantry operations of the kind conducted in Burma. One reason why is found in Calvert's charades. Although infantry combat by the Second World War was a complex art, potentially involving many different weapon systems, the basic tasks which any given group of soldiers had to perform were few in number and inculcated by training. Orders to cover a given arc, to patrol an area, to hold fire until a certain event, and so on were relatively simple to communicate. Calvert noted, "Every soldier in the British Empire understands the same words of command." The Roman imperial army had proceeded similarly, with Latin as the language of command alongside native vernaculars spoken in the ranks of its non-Romanized soldiers. That's just a cast back to bring back my point about the army being ancient. The army is not modern. This is some other thing that we misrecognize in social theory. Okay. Now, you can begin to get an idea of this unwieldy, divided and ruled Victorian thing having to fight modern war with its high rate of casualties and its incredible logistic demands. And so during the war, a whole set of modernizing expedients are kind of introduced into the Indian Army under pressures of war. And I particularly like this photograph because they're trying to introduce a cap that will go for a whole bunch of different classes instead of the specific turbans, right? They're trying to get to a more unified, uniform soldier. As you can imagine, running, administering, and supplying a multicultural army of this kind stressed this elaborate system and put many of its different cultural pieces in motion, contradiction, and conflict. During the Burma campaign, a particularly serious problem was that of providing the correct rations to all the different classes of troops amid uniquely different logistical challenges. You had to get the right food to the right troops. And in Burma, there are no cold storage facilities, and they have no modern, ritually sanctioned, sea ration, of halal or jetka meat for the Indian troops. The British soldiers had tin bully beef that they would eat. They would say it's very bad. So, Indian soldiers, they got their meat and protein from, on the hoof, goats and things that you take with you, or from ghee. Or milk, and you can't get these things in the middle of Burma. So this is a very kind of serious problem. And how do you get the right kind of food to these guys? So at one point, 14th Army in Burma has available to it a whole bunch of dried whale meat, right? And they start, giving this out to the units. And some of the Muslim soldiers, using food as a kind of way to get across dissatisfaction or cause a little trouble or, get more out of the officers. They say, well, we know that a whale is a mammal. Was this killed halal? Are you sure we can have this? And so the Brits, now like trapped in their own kind of situation that they've created, they go to the Grand Mufti in Cairo and they get a fatwa that says, for purposes of eating, a whale is a fish. And they go show the troops this will be okay. And another story I'll just tell you without benefit of my notes if I can get the parts of this right. The Americans sent a lot of food to 14th Army. We did a lot of the supplying of the Brits in Burma. And so we sent them some pork and beef kidney soup. And so this one battalion, headed in this case by an Indian commissioned officer who later goes on to quite high command in independent India, his troops are really hungry. They need the nourishment. They've been in front lines for quite some time. And how do I give this to my Hindu and Muslim soldiers? It's in one can to offend both. And the can had a little heating mechanism on it. So what he did is he got together a group of his senior NCOs, and he kind of focused on, this is a really fascinating, self-heating can from America. Just ignore the pork and beef, about what it's in. Many of these VCOs would have English. The Army was also teaching its NCOs English. And so he got them to, a small group of them to eat the food, and then they went and spread it throughout the battalion. And the whole thing nearly comes apart when a version of that sanitary havildar, in this case a kind of uppity Hindu officer, who's going to be really angry about this food and blow the little situation that Timia has created with his troops. So they invent a fake emergency. The Japanese are attacking, and get this guy on his jeep and out of the situation so his troops can eat this food, right? So what he's done, it's a very interesting kind of a thing. British officers found in World War I in France and with Indian troops throughout World War II, the Indian troops were actually more flexible about what they would eat than the Indian Army was. Right? I have another kind of story where this British officer comes in and discovers his troops eating, bacon and sausage and eggs. It's like, oh my God, what have you done? And the troops are like, no, leave us alone. This is really good. We want to try this. Yeah, you see this sort of where this is being imposed rather than coming up, right? Because this whole thing is to control the army and stop it from unifying against the British, right? It's not about why it is Indians, they need this kind of respect in order to serve. Okay, let me catch up with my notes now. Here's his description of the Hindu officer. One look and I recognized the officious type of high-caste Hindu who would be horrified by the soup. He would spill the beans on my deception. Okay, go another one. Now if you're kind of with me on this setup, one of the things that goes on in World War II that is a problem for every army is how you replace casualties. If you're going to keep your units in the field, you have, at any given day, half the company might get it, wounded or killed or sick, right? Now, if it's an American unit and you have American replacements, you just feed them in, right? But what if the Pathan company loses half its soldiers on one day? The brigade has to have available to it, right, exactly that number of Pathans, Pathan NCOs, VCOs who are Pathan, and so on to keep that working. It's impossible. You can't actually do this. You can't have this elaborate array of ethnic groups available, at every place the Indian Army is fighting. And more than that, it just became the case that these martial classes that they restricted recruitment to began to run out of young men during the war. So what the Indian Army had to do was to begin to mix up troops together, right? So they would put Hindus and Sikhs, Muslims and Sikhs and Hindu, various different combinations would go into these companies. And the British officers who were doing this are forced by circumstance into this position, right? And what they have to do is come up with ways to make this situation work. And lo and behold, it turns out that you're kind of sensible if you're a little bit making sure the minority group doesn't get, oppressed because it's in a battalion where it doesn't, or in a company where it doesn't have its own NCOs and VCOs and so on. You could make it work. In one case that I talk about, I'm not going to bore you with extensively, they mixed different kinds of Muslim Hindu soldiers together, and they called it the chapati company. Right? Chapati is a kind of unleavened bread. And the idea was, we're all mixed together. And that became the identity that people group themselves around, right? That's a modular identity invented in wartime, which becomes the collective identity of that particular unit. Lo and behold, it turns out you don't need all this stuff. You could have organized it differently, because the Army is so flexible in the way in which its discipline operates and produces people to be soldiers. I mean, just to get you going a little bit, one thing to think about how this might be relevant to the rest of the world: what is the most successful multiracial organization in world history? Exactly. It's the U.S. Armed Forces. Think about that, right? It's a hard kind of thing, at one level to hear. But that's, I'd be happy to talk about it. Now, how is that the Army, when it decides to integrate, even though it's full of Southerners and people who have very racist beliefs, is able to integrate before society? Okay, just to come back to my notes. The Chapati Company episode shows that while the British officers had been indoctrinated in the principles of class division, under pressure they rewrote the rules. British officers took for granted that Indian soldiers came in different ethnic classes, which must be kept separate, and any interactions carefully regulated. It was this idea which created the problem they had to deal with when they had to mix troops together: how to keep the classes separate given the new organization of the battalion. But when force of circumstances led to the creation of Chapati-like arrangements, class proved more flexible in practice than martial race's discourse allowed. There was no necessary loss of effectiveness when class relations were changed, and such expedients were common and normal throughout the Indian Army in the Second World War, although you'll only find that in archives, not in the sort of published histories. Now, let me just briefly touch on some of the other aspects of the book before I close off here. Now, one of the things to think about, like this wonderful thing I'm telling you about the Army and its pedagogies, is how you take peasants who don't know how to tell time, most of whom, or a lot of whom, are illiterate before they join the Army, and you have to turn them into soldiers who can use modern equipment of a whole bunch of different kinds, right? And the Army has a kind of very tried and true way of doing this. The step-by-step manual, drill, is widely adapted to different military purposes and to recruits from different social, cultural, and educational backgrounds. As Gwyn Dyer comments, one of the most striking characteristics of armies is their use of rote learning and standardization, as any veteran in the audience can tell you. Just about any action that soldiers or units need to take can be broken down into steps and taught as a drill. This produces a shared standard among trainees of differing abilities, and with various teaching aids provides effective instruction with a minimum of cultural and linguistic competence. Training teaches troops what to do at the appropriate shouts or prompts of command, inculcating the ability to take the appropriate and correct actions, whatever they may be, in stressful and life-threatening situations. The unfamiliarity of Indian and African peasants with modern machinery posed problems. They had a great deal more to learn to reach the expected standard than did their counterparts in Britain, and many had to be taught to tell time. But the multicultural powers of drill enabled British Indian and British African forces to produce credible infantry and support troops. This is another photograph I quite like. It shows you how it is that you break stuff down into parts. This is the ammo carrier, this is the loader, this is the gun captain of a 3-inch mortar. And they're being inspected by the big general. But you can see here how it is that this pretty complex piece of machinery, a mortar, it's not like natural, it's not a toy. But you can teach people who would have never seen a piece of machinery like that how to use it in combat, by breaking down all the different parts of it and making them go through it again and again and again and again. Drill, right? Drill not just as a parade ground thing. Drill is something that is ceremonial, but drill is a method of pedagogy. Of course, a second part of the kind of ritual dimensions of drill concerns the production of group solidarity. It's a far more traditional use of the concept. Production of group solidarity, of differences between groups, and of hierarchies within groups. Now, one of the least convincing aspects of military sociology's turn to national society and politics is the notion that solidarity and discipline depend on the shared beliefs of soldiers, on a common ideology of some kind. Soldiers and mass armies are most obviously nationalism, but also Nazi ideology or things of that kind. Soldiers and mass armies were too varied in origin, education, and ability, and battle too stressful an environment for this to obtain. Ritual practices, by contrast, exercise their effects simply through participation in them. What rituals evoke and organize are sentiments, and not, in the first instance, ideas. The point of ritual systems is not to change belief, but to dispose people towards acting in particular kinds of ways. Yeah, so I argue, here you can see my ancient ritual, non-modern set of arguments going about this army thing in our midst. Now, the turn to ritual in the military leads to a final insight about casualties in combat, which I'll share with you before I wrap up. I think one more point. A basic presupposition of the debate over combat motivation across a range of perspectives is that casualties corrode and ultimately destroy group solidarity and fighting spirit. For Edward Shills and Morris Janowitz in Military Sociology's foundational paper, primary groups of soldiers break down when casualties and other losses are such that the unit can no longer meet the material or psychological needs of its members, right? So in this kind of modernist reading of armies, death is a problem for group solidarity. In a devastating riposte to Shills and Janowitz, Omer Bartov observed that in conditions of intense fighting and high casualties, primary groups of soldiers, buddies, have an alarming tendency to disintegrate. Therefore, how can primary group theory explain fighting spirit in high-intensity combat? For Bartov, only fanatical dedication to racial ideology could sustain German soldiers on the Eastern Front in the face of appalling losses and near-certain death. Other scholars debate the percentage of casualties at which a unit's surviving members start to avoid risk or the effects of casualty and replacement procedures on morale. But the underlying assumption is always this idea that casualties are a problem for solidarity. Now, without denying some of the ways in which this might be so, I argue that this kind of modernist combat motivation debate has inverted the primary significance of casualties. They are the very fuel of fighting spirit through logics of group sentiment, collective sacrifice, and blood debt. Casualties call forth energies for reprisal and intensify group sentiment among surviving members. Spilt blood generates the forces binding together the remaining soldiers. Death's revivification of social bonds occurs on both sides of a battle, creating a self-generating circuit of battlefield violence that doesn't need to have reference to the nation or ideology in an ideal type. Okay, coming to the end now. In recent decades, in its own way, the linguistic turn in the social sciences has really come to military history and sociology. For the last couple of decades, many scholars have sought to do with increasing historiographical sophistication is recover the mindsets of soldiers, their specific contexts, beliefs, ideas, feelings, humor, their experience of military service, war, combat, and the commission of atrocity, and so on. An underlying premise in this idea, this sort of cultural specificity of soldiers, is that armies and battlefields are places where soldiers express their national style, whatever that may be in historical terms. Battlefields, on this view, are sites of agency, expressive of the particular cultural character of troops. The reasons for intense combat, extracurricular violence, war crimes, and atrocity are to be found in the accounts of soldiers, their memoirs, letters, diaries, and other primary sources where they tell you their beliefs. A kind of connection is made between culture as thought and belief and battlefield behavior. Soldiers' representations, the evidence of their experience, in Joan Scott's phrase, are read as motivation. Too easily overlooked here are battlefield sources of combat behavior. The interaction of opposing forces in specific contexts creates patterns, a structure, if you will, of fighting, which shapes the behavior of soldiers and their units, a structure which falls on the heads of soldiers like a ton of bricks, regardless of their individual attitudes or beliefs. Now, this can be seen in Burma, where soldiers from many different parts of Britain and the Empire fought the Japanese in very similar ways, behaving not unlike the Japanese themselves in their refusal of surrender. There is a degree to which, and in a way in which, combat is no respecter of nations. The Japanese in these foxholes are not being given the chance to surrender because other Japanese soldiers who fought to the death despite wounds. The Sikh soldiers here, whatever they may think of the Japanese or the war or its purposes or the ideology, are engaging in a common pattern of Pacific War combat. They're making sure the Japanese are dead many times over. This pattern reproduces itself. Given no choice, the Japanese go out fighting until the last, encouraging the kind of tactics on the part of their enemies that you can see here. They're using white phosphorus grenades. That's sort of a pre-napalm napalm. In fact, it's used to ignite napalm bombs, and they're literally burning them to death. Because the idea is that even if they're wounded or playing dead, they may shoot me in the back, as many Japanese did in fact do. But once you think your enemy is going to do that, and you think you can't surrender and they think they can't surrender, you create pressures to fight to the death no matter what, or to do this kind of thing. Well, you know, they're not being given a chance to surrender. This is a pattern reproducing itself irrespective of people's beliefs or ideas about the war that they're fighting in. You don't have a choice in this, or much of one. Okay, to conclude. The Indian Army and other British imperial forces were part of the globalization of Western forms of military discipline. What made the Army globalizable was its cosmopolitan character and the adaptability of its sturdy and robust techniques to different social and political contexts. Many armed forces today began their institutional histories in colonial context under imperial tutelage. The Kenyan Army was formed out of the King's African Rifles. The Nigerian Army started life as the Royal West African Frontier Force. The story is similar in much of former French Africa and the successor states to the British Raj in South Asia and elsewhere. Other armies have mixed or informal imperial parentage. The South Korean Army and National Police began in Japanese imperial service and then developed into national armed forces in the late 1940s under American occupation. The United States, of course, has trained, advised, and supported Latin and Central American armies and other security forces for over a century. Armies may appear to be the principal national, even nationalist institution, but their histories are very often imperial and global in one way or another. The cosmopolitanism of the regular army made possible these histories, arraying brown and black men in disciplined order to kill and violently repress other brown and black people was central to the making of the modern world. Thank you.